Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui in Tianjin. As world economic growth remains weak, the UK has voted to quit the EU after a historic referendum. British Prime Minister David Cameron says he will step down by October. So what does the future look like for the EU? In Asia, the South China Sea disputes have escalated and the US has stepped up intervention. How will relations between China and the US evolve in such circumstances? To discuss these and other major issues facing the world today, I'm glad to have Mr. Bremmer with me. He is the president and founder of Eurasia Group. Before we get started, let's look at this.
Pressure on the British government from all sides. In Berlin, EU foreign ministers urged UK Prime Minister David Cameron to stand down quickly to allow exit talks to get underway.
Of course, they must appoint a new Prime Minister. It will probably take a few days, but there is some urgency. Why? Because it is in the interests of the British, as well as the Europeans, that we do not allow a period of uncertainty.
Germany's Foreign Minister Frank-Walter Steinmeier said speed was essential for the EU's reputation of competence. The UK's highest level diplomat in Brussels, European Commissioner Jonathan Hill, is to resign, saying he did not believe it was right for him to carry on his work as the Commissioner in charge of financial services. And there's a fresh threat to the integrity of the United Kingdom. Scotland's devolved government has said it will enter into immediate discussion with the European Union to protect the country's place within the EU.
Good morning,
all
everybody.
Areas of Scotland voted to remain in the £500 million strong trading bloc.
A second independence referendum is clearly an option that requires to be on the table, and it is very much on the table.
Following a survey showing young people voted overwhelmingly to remain in the EU, and it was older people who voted to leave, Britain's Labour opposition leader Jeremy Corbyn has said the young need protecting from the consequences of the Brexit referendum.
Welcome to Dialogue, sir.
Thank you very much.
When you look at the outcome of the Brexit in Britain, the Leave campaign prevailed. Are you surprised, and how do you review the consequences?
With Brexit, I wasn't surprised. I was disappointed, certainly. I mean, it's hard to be surprised if you look at the polls. I mean, they've been razor's edge for 3 months. I mean, you know, 52-48 one way, then 52-48 the other way. I mean, it was always going to be very close.
The crux of the question, Ian, however, is the issue of populism. Do you think this is a very destructive force?
I think that populism is an understandable force. I think that when you have... It's so interesting that the authoritarian states right now are more in favor of globalization, it seems, than some of the developed, advanced liberal democracies, right? And it's, of course, because globalization has enriched the top 1%, and globalization has also brought a rising global middle class. But in between those two groups, you actually have had a hollowing out. And I don't blame the Chinese for this. What I blame are the people, the governments of these developed countries that have had the resources but have not done anything to ensure the continued viability of the social contract that they have with their citizens.
Don't you think in doing that, for example, in hosting the referendum in the UK, politicians and elites have been held hostage by the majority tyranny? And majority tyranny may be the euphemism for populism.
Well, in the UK, there didn't need to be a referendum. There was a referendum because Cameron decided that he wanted to be Prime Minister again, and so he put his personal ambitions and his personal enrichment, if you will, ahead of the will of the people. And that's a failing. And Boris Johnson decided that he could be Prime Minister, and so he put his own will ahead of the common interests of the people. The British people, their interests were subverted by this process. It was an extremely divisive and polarizing campaign that brought no pride or honor to the British people. And the Brexit itself is clearly going to lead to a further unwind in the United Kingdom over time, and will also weaken both Europe and the transatlantic relationship to a significant degree.
But many of our viewers in Europe, and particularly in the UK, may question your wisdom in giving this analysis, because they say, hey, in represents the elites, and whatever the elites say should not be trusted. Is that the mainstream thoughts of what we call populism? Anything but elites, that could be the mainstream, and that would be dangerous, don't you think so?
They should say that. You know, I'll tell you a story. I think that the Trans-Pacific Partnership is an extremely important strategic benefit for the United States and its allies. The most important thing Obama's done in 8 years in foreign policy, and hopefully will be concluded in the lame duck session if Hillary Clinton is made president. But I was at the Virginia Military Institute recently, which is the first, before West Point, first military institute established in the United States, speaking to thousands of cadets, young cadets. And one of them asked me a question afterwards when I had said the same thing about TPP I just said to you. And he said, my family's from West Virginia, and they've closed down the industry. They said NAFTA was going to be good for us. It wasn't good for us. They've done nothing for us. Why should I vote for TPP? Why should I do what you're saying is good? I said, you shouldn't. You shouldn't, because the government and the elites have failed you. And I'm not going to lie, right? Unless you are able to force these people to know that there will be consequences, you vote in protest, you demonstrate, you do something, then your interests will not be served. And I think that that's what's happened, is that the social contract has been broken, and the trust in elites across the board, whether you're talking in the United States about the Democratic or the Republican Party leaderships, you talk about public intellectuals, talk about the mainstream media, even corporate CEOs, the trust for these organizations and their leaders has deteriorated dramatically across the developed world.
Yes, indeed, the relationship, which is increasingly fragile between the ordinary folks and elites, is likely to break up. But what do you think of the possible campaign success of Donald Trump, who may represent the will and the interest of populism, who may not know very well what TPP actually means for the national interest of the United States?
That's certainly true. And they do know what free trade means for the U.S., by the way, and they generally oppose it because they don't think that they've benefited from it. Even though the prices come down, if you don't have a job, prices that are cheap don't necessarily help you so much. Look, I don't think Trump's going to win. Trump absolutely reflects the anti-establishment sentiment, but so did Bernie Sanders. Trump also reflects something else, which is a support for, sort of white, religious, conservative values. It's anti-Mexican, it's young people in America are actually much more multicultural. They like immigrants. Young people in America are much more secular. They're much more interested in gay rights and civil unions, in drug legalization. And in other words, those people really don't support Trump. And what's so interesting is that the support for Bernie Sanders and his like, that anti-establishment class-based interest, that's going to get bigger in the U.S. The Trump identity politics piece, that's actually only going to get smaller because those people are literally dying off. And one of the reasons to be more optimistic about the U.S. as opposed to Europe is precisely because the youth in America are much more interested in diversity of opinions, in diversity of models, economic models, political models, and of course, again, secularism, which is a much more, live and let live perspective, which is precisely what you see the Brexiters and Trump arguing against. I'd be very surprised if Trump was able to win the election short of a Hillary health issue or, God forbid, a major terrorist attack in the United States. I think if we just have a normal election, Trump is likely to lose quite big.
Let's look at whether the far-right movement in Europe and populism in Europe as well as the same movement in the United States are likely to gain more momentum, and more dynamics will be injected in the extreme thoughts that will challenge conventional wisdom and established orders about immigration or whatever. Is that a more dangerous thing that's going to take place and prevail?
In Europe, yes, and we see it. It's not just Brexit and the right wing of the Conservative Party and UKIP, which are now the UK Independence Party, which of course are now resurgent after that knife-edge but successful referendum to leave the EU. But we see this with the National Front in France. We see it with the Five Star Movement. They recently won decisively the mayoral race in Rome and in Turin, and they're going to be challenging Renzi there. The Swedish Democrats, who are Swedish but certainly not democratic, the True Finns, Podemos in Spain, the Alternatives for Deutschland in Germany. You go to every single European country and you see these movements becoming stronger. Now, in the big European governments, they're not strong enough to win election. But in some of the weaker and smaller, like East European, Southeast European states, they are winning. They've won in Poland, they've won in Hungary, they've won in Slovakia and Austria, where they only lost by 30,000 votes. Between you probably know Thomas Piketty's book on Capital, which talked about the inequalities in Europe. So between the hollowing out of the European middle class, which means many Europeans are very pessimistic about their future, unlike in China, many Europeans do not think they have opportunities, and you have these refugees that are not being integrated into Europe.
Right.
That's
Ian,
making it worse.
Given the disillusionment and anger of the mass in Europe, do you think, or do you foresee dissolution of the European Union? Do you think European Union will get stronger without the UK?
No, it'll get weaker. I wouldn't say disillusion, but I do think we will move to a two-track Europe, where there will be a core Europe that'll be relatively well governed, where these parties that you're talking about will stay on the fringe, and there'll be other countries that really subvert rule of law, the independent judiciary. They will look more like emerging markets. They won't be as integrated. So, I think about countries, like Poland. Poland, when the Soviet Union collapsed, Poland and Ukraine had the same per capita GDP. Of course, Poland's taken off like a shot. Ukraine's been flatlined. That's artificial. That's not going to last. So I think what we see is that the EU got too big. It went right up to Russia's borders, basically. It went right up the former Soviet Union's borders. It went right up to the Middle East. That's too far. There needed to be a buffer zone, not just geopolitically, but geoeconomically, also in terms of values and culture and rule of law. And so Europe will ultimately end up smaller. And I think that's probably an inevitability that will be sped up by the Brexit process.
But does it mean the United States will be very happy to see decline of the euro as one of the major reserve currencies? But you are watching Dialogue with Mr. Ian Bremmer, president and the founder of a Eurasia Group, the leading global political risk research and consulting firm. We'll be back in a short while. Please stay with us. Welcome back, sir. Do you agree that the US dollar will be stronger due to the departure of the UK from continental Europe?
Well, certainly that was the immediate market reaction, but I mean the United States used to be that the U.S. wasn't sure. During the Cold War, the U.S. frequently wasn't sure how strong a Europe or a weak Europe they wanted, because did the U.S. want to have to deal with sort of other decision makers, or just the U.S. makes decisions itself. I think right now it's very clear that the United States needs a strong Europe, and so does China, and the Chinese know this as well. I think it's increasingly clear the Americans need a strong China. I think it's clear to the Chinese need a strong America. There is convergence. I mean, ultimately, the Americans and the Chinese are both much more status quo powers as the world becomes much more unstable and volatile. And that's a stabilizing thing. It's one of the few stabilizing things out there. Neither the Americans nor the Chinese are applauding Brexit. this is a negative consequence because it undermines global stability. And in the same way the Americans and Chinese can work together on climate in Paris, this is an issue we'll see more cooperation on.
But let's look at the UK. Last year, when President Xi Jinping was visiting the United Kingdom, Britain promised to be a doorway to the West, or perhaps even to the United States, because after all, London is a very close ally of Washington. But do you think the UK is likely to lose its clout and to lose its influence at such a doorway because of its Leave campaign?
Of course. The special relationship is weaker than it used to be. Britain's going to be less relevant to China, both as a doorway to the United States, also less relevant to China as a leader in the European Union, of course. They've already been a problem for China in the sense that, right now the Brits have said we want to just focus on economics, but you can get a new government in the UK that'll say let's meet the Dalai Lama, a new government that says let's talk about Hong Kong, let's talk about human rights. The Brits have always had, sort of more willingness to play about geopolitics and values, where the Germans, for example, they say let's just build, sort of a partnership that focuses on common interests in the economy and industry. So, clearly I think the Chinese will be spending a lot more time in Germany over the next few years. I suspect they will spend less time in the UK.
But let's look at what you say on one occasion. For the first time in 7 decades, there is no single power or alliance of powers ready to take on the challenges of global leadership. Why? And what does a leadership vacuum in the world power structure actually mean?
Well, I call it the G0, and it means that it's not a G7 or a G20. We can recognize that the old global order was globalization, but it was also Americanization, right? All of the post-war institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, the Bretton Woods Agreement, the WTO, the UN, these were American institutions that sounded global. They had American allies, American priorities, American capital. Well, what we now see is globalization is continuing, but Americanization is not. And while the Americans are not prepared to continue to be the global policeman or the global architect of trade or the global cheerleader for values, nobody else is willing to do that or capable of doing that either. The Chinese have...
But the building of TPP may be the undoing of the very purpose of Americanizing the world. Don't you think this will be counterproductive?
I think the TPP was one of
because it rejects China, the second largest economy.
Well, first of all, the TPP is a recognition that the U.S. can no longer lead global institutions. You can have in the G0, you can have global institutions that are not led, or you can have institutions that are led, but they aren't global.
But are you saying that the United States will rewrite the rules because of the alleged outdated regulations of the WTO, from which China benefits enormously since
I think WTO is,
since the year 2001?
I think WTO is great, and let's keep in mind when the WTO was first put together, nobody thought the Chinese could join, and ultimately they did, and that was a huge success for both the Americans and the Chinese. Biggest success in the contemporary era of the relations of both countries. I think the Chinese will, if they are successful economically, the Chinese will ultimately join the TPP. And I think that that's a great thing. And the Americans...
Do you think it's a good thing for China to be admitted to the TPP?
I think it is a great thing
Why?
for China to get to the stage of economic development that they will be able to join the TPP, and they should be welcomed.
But there is
that is absolutely my view.
But few people deny that there are some geopolitical overtones in the TPP, which means some kind of a rivalry between the two biggest competitors in the Asia-Pacific region. Therefore, the United States is not really ready to accept China.
Look, the United States will need to become much more willing to truly share a global stage with China over time, and the Chinese will need to develop their economy in ways that are much more open and transparent in terms of governance, right? So if those things happen, then the TPP will be open for Chinese membership. If it doesn't happen, that probably means that China development has stalled, and that's bad for everybody.
Many would question your perception that China is a state capitalism. In fact, many of your American allies and friends have accepted China as a market economy, except for the EU and the United States, and some members shamefully of the BRICS group. They refuse to accept China as a market. So there are divisions, there are disputes as to whether China has become a market economy or not, right? Have you noticed? So there are differences and disputes between you and those other observers of China's economic development in their perception of whether we are market economy or not.
Well, look, what we agree on is that China is on a path of transition, and China is, an authoritarian state that has had a state capitalist economy, but clearly there are strong and growing elements of the private sector inside the Chinese economy. And by the way, in the United States, which is a free market economy, there are also areas that are clearly critical to America's strategic interests that therefore have very limitations. I mean, Lockheed Martin is not selling to countries unless they're American allies. So you could say, well, isn't that state cap? I mean, clearly, if you want to make the argument that everything is a gray area,
it is national security.
Yeah, it's national security, and national security is also including the information sector, for example. And in China, national security will have strategic sectors on the basis of economic growth priorities. Question: that China is still a relatively poor country, right? It's becoming a middle-income country.
Per capita income, yeah.
I think that the Chinese, in order to be consumer-driven as an economy, will clearly, and the leadership reflects this, need to continue to reform. I think that brings China day by day closer and closer towards the TPP and other such institutions over time. That should be welcomed. By the way, I think the Americans clearly should have joined the Asian Infrastructure Bank.
Question is whether China wants to join the TPP, since you talk so negatively about China's lack of rule of law, authoritarian nature of the government.
Not negatively at all. I mean, I think if China was a democratic state and you had free elections tomorrow in this country, you would have an illiberal outcome. It would be a country which, I mean, you said it yourself, the rule of the mob. I mean, when you have elections in Gaza, you get Hamas. If you have elections, sort of in Afghanistan before the economic conditions are correct, you get a disaster. So I don't smart in America that thinks that, oh my God, we want the dissolution of the communist state tomorrow. That's ridiculous. This is a transition. Now, look, we can have disagreements about how much transparency would be good or bad, how much is dangerous, in the same way that North Korea today, I mean, the Americans and Chinese actually have a lot of common interests around North Korea. You open that country up even a little, the place could implode. Well, in China, you're opening up quite a bit, and the place has not imploded. That's a good thing, and yet I think everyone understands that giving universal suffrage to the Chinese people tomorrow would not be a stabilizing tendency.
Talking about the Americanization of the global and international institutions since the end of the Second World War.
And that's over, yeah.
That's over?
Yeah.
And therefore, what do you think of China's demand for a greater share of, say, IMF and our demand for greater recognition as a rising power? Does it run counter to Americanization, or does it? Of course it does. Does it run counter? Does it amount to de-Americanization?
Of course. I mean, the rise of China is one of the reasons for the de-Americanization of global institutions. The rise of the BRICS more broadly, the rise of emerging markets, the weakness of Europe.
Do you think we are a threat to the United States?
I think everyone in the United States that matters believes that the mishandling of the rise of China would be the biggest threat to the global order. Kissinger talks about that, very widely respected here. And the Chinese, I think, would say the same thing, right? I mean, the good thing about the US and China relationship is that both sides actually pay a lot of attention to each other. They actually have respect for each other.
Yeah, we have a strategic and economic dialogue. We have a lot of summit meetings on different occasions.
We also have mutually assured economic destruction. We need each other so much that the best way to assure peace between the US and China is for the Chinese to be so invested in the United States that we are too big to fail. that the Chinese are like, oh my God, we've got to keep sending our kids to Harvard. Oh my God, we've got to keep buying real estate in New York. America has to be an attractive economy and open to the Chinese.
We are doing that because of the discussion of BIT.
Yeah. Well, it's not moving anywhere, but nonetheless, there is that level of economic integration. I mean, Trump can say that he wants to put 40% tariffs on China, but American corporations would be decimated if they couldn't produce at cheap levels in China. They'd be decimated. So Americans need the Chinese economy desperately.
We have $3 trillion US dollars.
That's right.
Forex in your country.
We like that.
Oh, yeah.
That's good.
And the cyber security, climate change, denuclearization process in Iran, we have a lot of common stakes together.
Cyber would not be the one I would promote if I were you guys, but certainly...
breakthrough has been delivered in this area of cyber security.
I think that you would find that both sides still think of each other as threats from the cyber perspective. They do, both sides do, there's no question. But if you want to talk about climate, there's a recognition on the part of the Americans and the Chinese that we are both destroying the climate. We need to do something about it. That's a positive thing. There's a recognition that both sides really need each other. After the 2008 financial crisis, the Chinese stepped up and was a critical reason why the world economy got back on side. This was not like the US-Soviet relationship, and it's not like the US-Russia relationship.
No.
Russia wants Trump. China doesn't want Trump. China would much rather have hawkish Hillary Clinton, where at least we respect
You have
each other.
simplified China by saying China does not want Trump. There are a lot of crazy guys in China who love Trump.
Of course, Chinese leadership does not want...
You're talking about the Chinese leadership.
Well, yeah, because you're the one that's worried about the dictatorship of the masses. In China, we don't have to worry about that.
But thank you very much.
Well, my pleasure, man. Good to see you.